In this video, I want to introduce Firebase Authentication, which will allow us to implement a login flow to our quiz platform. And this will be our first step towards being able to store user data in our application and then eventually add security so that only specific users can access specific information within the application. So up until this point, we've only used one of the Firebase suite of tools, which was the Cloud Firestore. So that was our NoSQL database. Firebase Authentication is another service. It's another tool in that suite, and this one is specifically about authentication, and authentication is us confirming that the user is who they say they are. It's about confirming the identity of the user. So Firebase Authentication handles the hard part for us and just gives us back a unique ID that then we can use for storing information in our database and retrieving information in our database. It comes with a number of different sign-in options, which you can see here. Like we've got email and password. We have federated identity provider integration, so like your social login of logging in with Google or Facebook or GitHub, as well as phone number, your own custom authentication, and anonymous authentication. We're going to be digging into Google. That's the easiest one to get started with because this is all in the Google suite of tools. We won't have to do a lot to get this working. So that's going to be our focus, but you can always dig in deeper to add other forms of authentication if you're interested in them. So let's start with looking at the docs. Firebase docs are really great, and ultimately you want to get to the point where you don't need me to explain things, you just go straight to the docs. So I'm going to show you how to parse some of the docs here, and then we're going to jump into it with coding. So over here on the sidebar for authentication, you can see that there's the web section. That's where we want to be. The Getting Started section gives you a high-level preview of what it's like to work with Firebase Authentication, and then there are specific pages for the different providers, the different ways that we can log in, and we'll head to the Google one in a second. So on the Getting Started page, it talks about getting your Firebase module in there, getting the SDK in there. There's this optional section on using the local developer tools, and then we can see a preview of signing up new users and signing in existing users using email and password. And we can see that they're both using the Firebase Auth here. So Firebase Auth gives you access to the authentication service, much like when we did Firebase.Firestore, it gave us access to the Firestore database service. So once we have access to that service, we can call different methods for creating users and signing in users. And you can see that both of these return a promise-based interface. So creating a user with email and password gives us something that we can chain a then on to handle when that was successfully created, and a catch when something went wrong. And same thing down here for signing in. Promise-based interface then gives us what happens when it was successfully fulfilled, and catch when something went wrong trying to sign in that user, and then we can inspect the error code to figure out exactly why something went wrong. So there's also a observer, so a callback that we can, or a method that we can provide a callback to that lets us know anytime the authentication state has changed, which we will definitely have to use when we get in there, and we'll talk about why we need this. This will be helpful in figuring out the initial state of our user when they come back to the page after having logged in. So that's the preview of our Firebase authentication, and it's helpful to also pull up the reference. So I'm going to try and do these side by side here. So the API reference here, if we go to JavaScript and then we go to Auth overview, we can see all of the things that are in the Firebase Auth module. So when we have been working previously, we've been working inside of Firebase Firestore, and now we're going to be working inside of Auth. And you can see that there is a callable method here that Auth returns that we can then use to get access to the authentication service. So that's what we're doing here. We're calling the Auth method in Firebase Auth here. And then once we have that, it gives us back an Auth instance, which we can see here. And this is the authentication service. So it has certain properties, like there is the current user property, which we can see either gives us a user or gives us null if no one is signed in. And then it has a bunch of methods here, like let's look at create user with email and password, which we can see here. So once we have that auth service, we can call create user with email and password, pass in an email, password, and it's a promise that resolves to not a user, but a user credential. And then it has listed the possible error codes that it may throw. So we'll keep that API reference handy. The other thing I want to do with the docs here is take a quick look at the Google sign-in process. So this is going to be a little bit different than the getting started page. So it's telling us that we have to create in our Firebase console, or enable in our Firebase console, the Google sign-in method. So we'll have to do that before we jump into our code. And then the flow looks slightly different. So there are 3 optional steps that we're going to ignore for this video. The first step we're going to have to do, so we're going to create a new Google Auth provider. So this is the thing that handles interacting with the Google Auth the OAuth 2 flow. And then once we have that, we can still talk to our authentication service, and we can call the sign in with pop-up method, but provide the specific handler of the OAuth 2 flow. So we're going to provide our Google authentication flow here. And then we get a promise-based interface. So we can call .then to figure out when it was successful and catch when something went wrong. And this pop-up flow is going to actually pop up a window on top of our application that is handling the Google login. So if we take another look back at our docs here, at the top of auth, we are going to look for the sign in with pop-up. And you can see you give it an auth provider, it returns a promise that resolves to a user credential, and then there are a whole bunch of specific errors that it might throw in this process. So that's our high-level preview of what we're going to be doing here. You can see that the Firebase Authentication Service handles a lot of the details for us. So for instance, with the Google login flow, we don't have to implement the OAuth 2 protocol for signing in. This is handled for us. With the email and password flow, we don't have to store the email and password. We don't have to encrypt the password in our database. This is all handled for us, and we just get a handy user object back that we are then able to use in our application. So getting started, we are going to be working inside of the past version of our quiz application. And we're going to be working on the home page here and getting us a really simple login flow working. So you can download or you can use whichever version of your quiz application you want. I'm using the one from the last video here, and this has our blank home page. I have this running currently in my browser. So before we can start working in the code, we need to do the enabling of the login process in our web console. So I'm going to flip over to my web console here and head into the application. And then over on the sidebar, there is Firestore, where we have been inspecting things that are in our database. We've got our users from the last time we were playing with Firebase. And then under authentication, this is the panel for configuring the authentication service. And you may see a page that has a getting started button that you have to click on before you get to this window. Once we're here though, we can go to the sign in method, and you can see that all of the providers are disabled by default. And then we go in and specifically enable the ones that we want. So if I want to turn on Google, I'm just going to hit enable. I'm going to make sure that I've got a support email set, and then I'll hit save, and that's enabled. And same thing for email and password. If I want to flip that on, I'll turn that on and hit save. For our purposes, I'm just going to leave this with the Google provider as the only way to log into our application. So once we've got that set up, anytime we log in or create an account, anytime we create an account, we will see that user listed here, and we will see their unique ID listed here. And that unique ID is what we'll be able to use when we're storing that user's information. From this page, we'll also be able to delete users from our application. So if we want to get rid of an account that we've added during testing, we can do that on this page. So with that in place, we can now flip back over to our code and start working on this login system. So the flow for what I want to do here, I want to play with the authentication module. Let's just get something working so that we can figure out how to interact with Firebase. And then we will build our user interface, and then we will hook it all together and kind of create the full experience of the user interface hooked up to the authentication. The first place we need to go is to our Firebase module that we created that configured our application. So we had our credentials in here. We made sure to throw errors if we were missing any of these. These are helpful for debugging later, especially when we deploy and we maybe forget to add those credentials in there. And then we set up our database, and then we exported our database at the bottom. So we want to set this up so that we also configure our authentication service and export our authentication service. So up here, we need to import Firebase Auth. So this brings in the core functionality, and then any of the services we want to use, we have to import them specifically here. So I'm going to rename this comment. This brings in the specific services we want to use. So now at the bottom, when we're creating our database object, which is our interface to Firestore, we can do the same thing for Auth. And we now have the authentication service, which is, still got my API docs here, is this object. So with that, we can ask for the current user, and we can call any of these methods for creating accounts and signing in. The other thing we want to do is create the Google provider for logging in. So this is what we saw under the Getting Started page for Google. So we are creating a new provider, which is the Google Auth provider here. And then when it comes time to actually log in with that pop-up flow, we're going to need to use this provider and configure our auth method by passing it in. So I'm going to export both of these, auth and provider, so that we have access to them outside of this data file. And then we can close our Firebase file and head back to our home route here. And so we're not going to handle the proper asynchronous loading and error state yet. What I just want to do is refactor this homepage so that we use that auth and provider to actually log in and log out. Once we've got the basic flow working, then we can add in the proper sort of loading state and error handling. So let's test this out. What I want to do is create a sign in asynchronous method here. And I also want a sign out async method here. And then for our home page, instead of saying home here, we can say welcome. Let's name our app something goofy like Quizzer. And then let's put 2 buttons on the page, one for sign in and one for sign out. And when we click on sign in, we want to call our sign in method or our sign in function and do the same thing for sign out. And let's make sure that this is working. So I'm just going to throw an alert in here, an alert in here, let Prettier handle formatting this, and then flip back to my browser. So it doesn't look pretty, but this will give us enough to actually play with signing in and signing out. So I can flip back to my code here. And if we look back at the docs, actually here, let's look back at, where did it go? Yeah, here we go. If we look at the Google sign-in page, and let me bring both of these windows together. We create the provider, and then when we want to sign in, we talk to our authentication service, and we call sign in with pop-up with that provider. And then we can handle the promise-based logic around that. So if it was successful, we will end up in the then, and if it was unsuccessful, we'll end up in the catch. So this is what we want to do in our sign in method on the homepage here. So I'm going to bring in auth. Oops, actually, let's import that first. My IntelliSense isn't picking it up, so import auth from. We are in the home page, so we want to go into data, Firebase, and let's also add the provider here. So this is promise-based logic, so we could do it in the regular promise flow with then and catch, or because we have an asynchronous function, we can wrap this in a try catch and do our await flow for handling promises. So I'm going to create a variable called credentials, and we will store the return value of the promise or the resolve value of the promise in there. And I'm going to sign in with pop-up using our provider. So this is just what we're seeing in the docs, but in our async flow, not in the regular promise flow. So now we could do a console log signed in. And let's also console log the credentials. And down here, if something goes wrong, let's console error the error message. We can get rid of our alert. And pop open the console so that we can see what's going on. When I click sign in, we get our pop-up window, and then it will provide to us, if you have multiple accounts, the ability to choose which account you want to log into. If you don't have multiple accounts, then you won't see the options here. And then if I were to cancel this flow, like hit the X, it's going to take a second for our application to register, and then our error is being printed out. And we can see that the code here is auth pop-up closed by user. So if we wanted to make a nice user interface, we would check the code, which we saw in our documentation under the sign in with pop-up here. Here are the possible error codes. So we could then check that that error occurred and then give the user feedback of like, hey, you know, you have to actually interact with that pop-up window and choose an account to log in. Okay, so let's do it successfully this time. Log in, and now I have a credential object back to me, which has some information about what operation occurred, some information on the credentials, some information on the user, and we can inspect some of this in our documentation in the API reference. So we can see sign in with pop-up gives us back a promise that resolves to a user credential. So if we check out the user credential here, we can see it has the additional user info, the credential, and then the user here. I skipped the operation type, and the user at the end here. What we are probably most interested in at this point is just the user. So if we click on the user, we can see here are a bunch of properties and methods. So we could get the display name of the user or the email of the user. Or we have methods here like actually deleting the user's account if we wanted to add that into our flow. So let's use the display name here. And because we're logging in with the Google Flow, that'll actually be pre-filled by the Google account. This may not be there if you decided to use the username and password flow. And then let's also print out the UID. So the UID is a unique user ID. This is what Google authentication or Firebase authentication is giving back to us to say, like, this is the unique user's ID. The only way that we could get this ID from the user credential is if this user is who they say they are. So we can actually use this to store information in our database and use this to write some security rules on our database. So let's grab the user from the credentials object, and then from the user we can grab the display name and the UID. Actually, why I don't need to do 2 lines here. Let's just do credentials.user, and then we can console log welcome back. Let's turn this into a template string. And let's put the user ID in parentheses here. And if we go ahead and try signing in again, and click on my same account, we'll see my name printing out and my user ID from that user object. And we can also head to our authentication window, and if I refresh the page here, we should see that there is now a user for that, one user in our authentication users panel. And I can see my user ID here should map to the same thing that I'm seeing here. And one thing that I should highlight is with this flow, the Google Flow, sign in with pop-up, both signs the user back in and allows the user to create a new account. So we don't have to do a separate sign in, create account button. It's all one operation. So now that we've got sign in working, let's get sign out working. So if we look back to our authentication service here, we have a bunch of different sign in methods, but then there is only one sign out method. And this is just a method that returns a promise that resolves to void. So we can await that promise. It won't give us a return value, but when that promise finishes, as long as there was no error, we know that we're signed out. So if we head back here, we can do a similar try and catch the error if there is one. We will await auth.signout. And then we can print out something like signed out after the promise resolves. And let's make sure that we at least get an error printing out to the screen if something goes wrong. We can get rid of our alert here. So we should have a functioning login system, even though it's not pretty and not styled. I should be able to sign in. Welcome back, and sign out and get my signed out message. So this is functioning, and we've got the pieces of the auth system that we need working. But now it's time to start working on the user interface. So instead of always displaying both sign in and sign out, it would be nice if we only displayed sign in when they weren't logged in, and when they were logged in, we only displayed sign out. So we'll have some conditional contents that we will put on the page. And we should also handle the fact that these are asynchronous operations. So we should display some kind of loading indicator on the page to let the user know that, when we click the sign in, something is happening behind the scenes and that the application hasn't just frozen. And similarly, we want to do something when an error happens. The application shouldn't just silently fail. We shouldn't just be printing something to the console. We should actually display something on the screen. So this is going to involve some state. So what I want to do is create a user state and set user state here. And use state. And this will be an object where the user is null, is loading is false, is signed in, false, error, null. So these are the different aspects of the user state that we care about in terms of this page. We want a quick way to know whether we're signed in so we can figure out which contents to display. We want to know whether we're loading, whether there's an error, and then we probably also want to store the user so that we can do something like welcome back and put the user's name on the page somewhere. So I'm not concerned about how we hook this up to the auth system yet. In fact, I'm just going to hide these two methods. All I want to do is get this state variable hooked up to our user interface, and then we can use the React dev tools to play with some of these values to make sure that our user interface works. And then once we got that working, we can hook it all together. So the first thing that I think I want to do is create our contents for the page. So I'm going to create a variable here, and we're going to say if the user state dot is signed in, we will display our logged in content, and otherwise we will display our new user or logged out content. And then this is going to go on the page here under our H1. So if the user is signed in, then we can say that the contents of the page should be something like, I'm going to use a fragment here so that we don't have to wrap this in any HTML. And this could be, let's put a to-do, put the user's quizzes on this page. And let's grab our, oops, why did these expand? Let's grab our sign out button and we'll put it here. And let's we'll rearrange these so my sign in and sign out should be here so that we can use them in our contents code down here. So we've got our, we could eventually add like the user name here like we did in the printing out in the sign in button. I'm going to leave that alone for a second here. And then I'm going to grab my contents and put it under the else. And this would be where we can display like, this app lets you create, share, and play quizzes on any topic. Sign in with your Google account below to get started. And then here we want to display the sign in button. So we should be able to get this running, and we should be able to play with the state in React Dev Tools here. So if I go to my home page, I see my state, and if I flip is signed in from false to true, we can see our signed in version of our page. And back to false, we're on our signed out version of our page. So we don't have to actually hook this up to auth. We can test all of this using the React Dev Tools and playing with the state. So is signed in is working. Let's add in the error handling. So if something goes wrong when someone clicks the sign in, I want to display a little message above the info here to say like, oh, something went wrong, please try again. So we're storing an error field in the user state object. So down here on the page, we could do something like this. User state.error. And then use our error message component to say something went wrong, logging you in, please try again. And I'm going to make sure that I import this. So let's see if it pops up here. Nope. Okay, let's import it manually. Import error message from our common folder. Ideally, what we would do here would be to check the error code that we're getting back here from the error object and display something specific. So if it was that the user closed the pop-up, we could say something along the lines of please don't dismiss the pop-up. Or if the error was around a pop-up blocker, we could display a more specific error. Here, we're just going to go with a general purpose error. So give that a save, and we should be able to test this as long as we type something in here, like pretend that it pop-up was closed, is the error that we get back from the system. We're putting our generic error message on the page. Styling's a little wonky here, so we may want to polish that up in the future, but this is fine for now. And as soon as that error goes away, and we're back to like a null value or a empty string, nothing will display on the page. So quick review, this uses the fact that and short circuits if this first value is false, because it knows that there's no reason why we'd ever need to check that second condition with an and if the first thing's false. So this is a really short way for us to write something with a truthy or falsy thing on the left-hand side, and then the thing we want to execute only when that's true or truthy. Okay, so we got our error. I think the last thing we want to add here before we can hook this up to our sign-in flow is that we should display some loading indicator. So a really simple one on this would be, instead of saying sign in or sign out, we can do user state is loading. So if this is true, we will end up seeing signing out in the button. And if it's false, we'll see sign out. And we could also do disabled equals user state dot is loading so that the user can't click on the button as soon as we're in this loading state. And I'm going to copy this down here and change this to be signing in. Whoops. And sign in. I don't know that we have disabled styling for our button. So let's see what happens if we flip back to the browser and we say that we're loading. Okay, so the text changed, and if I inspect the element here, I can see that there's a disabled attribute, but our base styling that we created here doesn't actually, we're overriding some of the user agent styles, some of the default stuff provided by the browser. So let's add some quick CSS here in our index where we had styled our button for the page, and let's add a rule for disabled here. Whoops, that let's say the opacity of the button is 0.8, something really simple for us to get up and running. Okay, there we go. So when it goes into its loading state, we'll drop the opacity so that the button looks disabled. So this is loading is working on our logged out page. And then if we're signed in, it works on our signed in page as well. So now we can actually hook all of this together. So this state, rather than mocking it and playing with it in the dev tools, let's hook it up to the sign in and sign out methods that we created. And eventually, this should not be happening in our homepage. Right now, our homepage is responsible for way too many things, and it's a bit confusing to read it. Ideally, what we want is all of this state information to be in a custom hook so that the homepage doesn't need to know anything about authentication. It just gets the user state and reactively puts the right stuff on the page based on the user state. But just for working through the logic, it can be helpful to do all of it in one file at the jump and then refactor it into a custom hook after you've got it all working. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to make this messy, hook it up to our state, and then we'll eventually move it to a hook so that things are decoupled, so our homepage doesn't have to know about authentication. Okay, so in our sign in, what we want to do is set the user state to be loading. So let's say the user here is null and the is loading is true and the error is null and we are not signed in. Oops, do not want a semicolon there. And then after we have successfully got our credentials, we can actually say the user is equal to user credentials.user is loading is false, is signed in is true. And if something went wrong, then our user is null and our error is equal to whatever this error object is that we're getting back, and is signed in as false. And let's do a similar thing with signing out. So when we sign out, actually, we don't want to null the user immediately. What we probably want to do is set the user equal to something like user state.user. So it stays at whatever it was previously. We're just reaching into our user state and pulling the previous value. Is loading is true, error is signed in. We probably want this to be user state.user does not equal null. Null is the thing we're using in our user variable here, or user field, to indicate that there is no user logged in, and this mirrors what the Firebase authentication library gives to us. So then we can, after we sign out here, set the user to null, is loading to false, no error, is signed in is false. And if we've got an error, we will do a similar thing here. And let's use the previous user state here, and let's do the same thing for is signed in. So if something went wrong, we'll just default to whatever the user was before and our signed in state from before. So we should be able now to sign in and have our user information available to us for debugging purposes. Oh, you know what? Let's just use we'll use the React Dev tools to watch the state as we try logging in. So I've got the state pulled up here. I'm just going to refresh to make sure that we've got the most recent version loading. Got my hooks, open this up. So user's null, we're not loading, we're not signed in. If I click sign in, we can see that we are currently loading. And if I cancel this, we should end up with the error flipping here. Yep, so we can see the error object. It's telling us here's the specific code. Obviously, in the future, we should fix the styling and should handle these codes more gracefully rather than just a generic error message. But this is enough for now. And then if we sign in, our error gets cleared. And let's do it properly. And we can see we now have our user object here, which has my display name. In addition, has my UID somewhere in here. Oh, right there. Completely missed it, right above my display name. So we've got both of those pieces of information. And then from here, we should be able to sign out. And we can see we're no longer signed in. User has been nulled. So this is working. It is hooked up to our UI, but this component has become a mess. This is a pain to deal with because there's just way too much going on in here. So what we want to do is take all of this out of our homepage and put it into a custom hook so that the homepage is just responsible for the rendering. It does not know that we're even talking to Firebase Authentication. It is just getting its information provided to it from a custom hook that we'll create in a second. So let me undo that and let's go into our data folder. And I'm going to create a hooks folder in here where we can put some of our Firebase hooks. And I'm going to call this use user. And we'll call this use user and export it. And then we can grab this, put it in here. And we'll have to fix some of these errors in a second, but what I want to focus on is once we get this working, our hook needs to return something. So I'm going to return the user state, which is an object that has user is loading, is signed in, error. We could destructure this and put this into an array. But I find that as soon as I have more than like 3 things, it becomes unwieldy in a hook to use it as a array being returned, and I'd rather use it as an object. So this should be the general structure of our user hook. We want to store some state, we want to have some sign in, sign out methods, and then we want to return some object down here that we can use back in our home page. So now we can start fixing some of these errors and getting our application working with the custom hook. So our home page, we no longer need these imports. And let's, whoops. User state equals use user hook. And I hit control space to give me the IntelliSense autocomplete to import use user. So this is generally what I want to happen. I want to get all of the information provided to me by my custom hook, which I can use on the page. And almost everything is working again on this page, or at least the compiler errors have disappeared, except for the sign in and sign out methods. And those I actually want to provide on this user state object. So I could say user state.signout and user state.signin. And then we can flip back to working on the use user. So when we get down to returning something, actually what I want to return is an object that has all of our information, like the user, the is loading, is signed in, the sign in method, and the sign out method. So let's destructure the user state here into user is loading. Error is signed in. And oh, let's also throw the error in here. So this is closer to the shape of what we want. So what we're returning from this hook is the state plus anything else we think would be relevant to return. So we've included our sign in and sign out method. All right, let's go about fixing some of these compile errors. So I need to make sure that I am importing use state. So I'm hitting Control Space to bring that up. I want to make sure that I have my auth, which is not coming in. Nope, neither of those are being detected. So I'm just going to go ahead and import auth and provider from Firebase, which is just up one folder from our hooks folder. So that should have given us, that should have got us back to a working state in terms of no compile errors. And there are a couple of things that I want to do here before we try testing this out. So one is that I don't like having to maintain this is signed in state. We were doing that on the user interface side so that we had something we could play with in the dev tools. But is signed in is really a derived property of our user. So there's no reason why we need to store it in our state. And we don't need to modify it here. Oops. Did not mean to click that autocomplete. Don't need it here. Don't need it here. Don't need it here. And I believe these should be able to fit on one line now. And this one should fit in one line now. So because that is a derived piece of state, instead of storing it in the user state, I can just create an is signed in variable here, which is equal to whether or not the user equals null. So if the user is null, not equal to null. So as long as the user is not null, this is true. So we're signed in, otherwise we're not signed in. So removing that cleans up our state. We don't have to maintain as much state information. And any other derived properties that we want to add, like maybe we want to have a user ID that we also export so that we don't have to remember that the user ID lives inside the user and say user.uid. We could just reach in and grab the user ID property. This we could do is signed in. We will set it to user.uid. Otherwise, we will leave it as undefined. And then we can export that here as well. Or I shouldn't say export, I should say return from our custom hook. So let's head back to the home page here. Let's make sure we have no compile errors and flip back to our browser and refresh the page. And we can see our hook over here. This is showing us the state of our use user hook. I think what I want to do is let's print out user state here. So anytime this re-renders, which can be triggered by our use user hook, we will see the latest version of our user state as the application's running. So this will help for debugging purposes. It'll also help us just understand what's going on here. So let's refresh this. So start off with no user. The user ID is undefined. We're not loading. We're not signed in. But we do have the sign in and sign out method available to us. So let's go ahead and click sign in. we can see that our hook has triggered a change here because our state changed to be loading. And let's try causing an error. Our error happens, our state updated, so we're no longer loading, and we have that error stored in the state. So when we want to refactor this to be more of a graceful or more informative user error on the page, we've got the code stored, but we get a generic error on the page. Now we can try signing in again, and let's sign in and not dismiss it. And we can see that we're getting a couple of printouts here. So we've got one printout that is coming from the home page. This was when we popped open and flipped to loading. Then we've got a few things that are printing out from use user because we had these printing out in the home page before, and we just copied and pasted them over into our use user hook. And then our last thing here is the final result of logging in. We're no longer loading, we are signed in, and we've got our user and our user ID available to us. And then we should be able to sign out from here, where we can see that the final result is we're not loading, there are no errors, we're not signed in, there's no user, there's no user ID. So it's pretty easy for us to take that logic out of our home page, all of that authentication logic, and move it to a custom hook so that we don't have to think about any of the specifics of how the authentication works in our home page, which means that our home page, if we decide to leave Firebase behind and switch to AWS or switch to Azure and use an authentication service provided by them, all we have to do is update our hook. And as long as it maintains the same return value, this component will work with that different service. So we got a big benefit here by decoupling our user interface from our actual authentication logic. And then one thing I want to add here is, let's put a comment. I'm just going to copy and paste this in. So this is different from what we've done in previous hooks, and because there's a lot of data that I want to return, I would rather return an object that's easier for us to use on the home page by just saying user state.signout or user state.isLoading versus destructuring all of these here into sign in, sign out, is loading, user ID. I find that it's a little bit easier as soon as you have like 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 return values that you want to just return an object versus an array. All right, so we have a working login system here. The only problem is that this doesn't properly detect the cookie or local storage info that we've got in our browser for when we're signed in. So one of the things that Firebase provides to us is actually storing things in or persisting things in our browser storage when we're logged in. So actually, when I'm logged in right now, if I were to refresh the page, Firebase does actually have that user information and it re-authenticates me in the background. So a more improved version of this would actually detect that and not display the sign-in information, but display the sign-out information because all that user information is available in Firebase. So I'm going to wrap this video up here, but we will do that detection of the authentication state, the initial authentication state, in the next video, along with a few more improvements to this login system. Okay, wrapping up, we looked through the Firebase authentication service, we figured out how it worked, we read the API, we then were able to implement it and implement the Google Auth flow in here. And if you want to add other types of authentication flow using the different sign-in methods, you enable them here and you head back and you check out the guide relevant to those particular login flows. So with that, you should have a really basic login flow in your application now.